It's been a very long 2 days, long sessions, a lot of food for thought. But we now come to what I think a lot of people will consider to be the highlight of the conference. And it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Steve Levitsky, who's Professor of Government at Harvard University. I'm introducing him, but introducing such an eminent scholar, one always feels somewhat redundant because by definition, they need no introduction. But this is the duty that I have this evening. After completing his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in 1999, Steve Levitsky joined Harvard University as Assistant Professor of Government in 2000. He's remained there ever since, becoming a tenured Professor of Government in 2008. As I think most people here know, his research interests are very wide-ranging, including political parties, authoritarianism, democratization, and weak and informal institutions, with a focus on Latin America, but not exclusively so. His earliest research was on Peronism in Argentina, on which he published Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism in Comparative Perspective. He then went on to look at the importance of informal institutions for the exercise of democracy, which he discussed in his book, Informal Institutions and Democracy, Lessons from Latin America. And then in 2010, along with Lucan Way, he published Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. In this book, he developed the concept of competitive authoritarianism, a concept which he's applied not just to Latin America, but elsewhere. And he's continued to explore this concept and in examining its relationship to populism. Now, I've only mentioned 3 of his many books, and in addition, he's published very widely in journals and regularly contributed to the press and made media appearances as well. Many of the ideas that he's had found expression in his recent prize-winning book with Daniel Ziblatt, entitled How Democracies Die: What History Reveals About Our Future. I should say that the book is perhaps not as pessimistic as the title might suggest, but maybe he's changed his mind since then. The book was the winner of the Goldsmith Book Prize and shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, and also named as one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, Time, and Foreign Affairs. It was also described in The Economist as the most important book of the Trump era. So, Professor Levitsky, your work has been so important to thinking about the nature of populism and democracy that it's a real privilege to have you with us this evening. And so I'd like you to give your lecture to us. If you're willing, and if there's time, we wondered whether there might be the opportunity for 1 or 2 questions. So over to you, your lecture, I think, on the supply side of populism, the crisis of political establishment, and what it means for democracy.
Thanks, Linda, for that oops, you hear me? Thanks for that overly generous introduction, and thanks to Tony and to the King's Brazil Institute and the whole conference. This looks like a terrific set of panels and papers, and it's really a thrill to be part of it. So whenever I sit down to prepare a lecture on populism, I realize I don't know a damn thing about populism. I don't know about you all, but it's a rabbit hole. So I want to start with a conceptual point. I'm going to define populism as a phenomenon in which political outsiders mobilize subaltern groups from above against the entire political establishment. Populism for me is a fundamentally anti-elite phenomenon. Populists promise, in effect, to take a wrecking ball to the political establishment, to tell voters that the entire establishment, from university professors on the left to business people on the right, has turned its back on the people, that it's betrayed them, it's disrespected them, it's shat upon them. Populists attack traditional parties, traditional politicians as corrupt, as oligarchic, as unrepresentative, and they promise to sweep them away in favor of, in the name of some sort of more authentic democracy. This is Perón, it's Chavez, it's Fujimori, it's Bukele, it is Trump. But lately, it seems to me that we've been attaching the term populism, I speak in a very broad terms, not necessarily social scientists, but in the media, we've been using the term populism for a much, much broader set of phenomena. Authoritarians like Putin and Maduro, violent law and order types like Duterte in Philippines, ethno-nationalists like Modi in India, anti-immigrant parties in Europe. As far as I can tell, the only thing that unites all of these characters is illiberalism. So I worry that we're starting to conflate populism and illiberalism, that we're often using the term populist as a label for all illiberal politicians that we don't like. Now, most populists are in fact illiberal, but not all illiberal politicians are populist. Putin is not a populist. He came from the Russian establishment. The BJP in India, I don't think, is populist. Its core constituency is the Hindu elite. Daniel Ortega and Nicolás Maduro are not populist. They're just autocrats. So I think it's worth keeping a distinction, making an analytical distinction between populism and illiberalism, not conflating the two. And I think it's important that we continue to distinguish between the rise of populism and the rise of the kind of right-wing ethno-nationalism that we're seeing in various parts of the world. They're not necessarily the same thing. Some of these ethno-nationalist figures are in fact populist. Trump, I think, is a populist, but not all of them are. All right, now, as all of you know, populism is not new to Latin America. In fact, as long as there have been competitive elections and mass suffrage in Latin America, populism has been a constant in political life. Aya, Cárdenas, Vargas, Velasco Ibarra in the 30s, Perón, Gaitán, Velasco Ibarra again in the 40s and 50s, Velasco Ibarra yet again, Goulart, the military populists like Torrijos and Velasco in the 60s, Alan Garcia in the 80s, Bucaram, Fujimori and Chavez in the 90s, Lucio Gutierrez, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales in the early 2000s, AMLO, Bolsonaro, we get it today. The only time, as far as I can see, where we didn't see much populism in Latin America was during periods of outright military rule in the 1970s and the very early 1980s. So why does populism seem to be on the rise today, both in Latin America and elsewhere? The vast majority of explanations center on the demand side of populism, the question of why voters tend or support populist parties and populist politicians. And that makes sense. Focusing on the demand side makes a lot of sense. It is not every day that voters decide to throw out the entire political elite in favor of a failed coup leader, a reality TV star, or a political outsider that nobody's ever heard of. Voters have to be pretty freaking unhappy with the status quo for that to happen. They've got to feel excluded. They've got to feel betrayed, crapped upon. In other words, for voters to throw in their lot with political novices who promise to bury the entire political elite, there has to be a fair amount of public discontent. But focusing on the demand side makes sense. Now, quickly, in the United States and Europe, there are two major explanations for rising demand for populism: economic story and a cultural story. The economic story focuses on the consequences of globalization, competition from China, rising inequality, and declining social mobility, particularly in areas that are not well integrated into the emerging knowledge economy, particularly small towns, rural areas. This is the story of the American Rust Belt voting for Trump. It's the story of England's Northern Rust Belt voting for Brexit. Cultural explanations focus more on status and identity than on material loss. So, you know, Western societies have undergone some pretty far-reaching cultural changes over the last half century: the rise of feminism, gay rights, multiculturalism, and the like. Scholars like Pippin Norris and Ron Engelhardt argue that these cultural changes have triggered a backlash, particularly among rural, church-going, non-college educated people. There is, of course, a huge racial component to this cultural story. Most Western democracies have experienced large-scale immigration over the last 40 years, and growing ethnic diversity, together with steps towards racial equality, have also triggered a huge backlash. Now, clearly, both economic anxiety in the context of globalization and status anxiety in the context of growing racial and cultural diversity are at work today. It's also the case, as Sherry Berman reminds us, that established political parties did relatively little over the last 30 or 40 years to respond to these anxieties. For a generation, starting in the 1980s, established parties on the center left and the center right embraced globalization and at least tolerated immigration. That left a pretty good sized chunk of the electorate, maybe 30, 35, 40%, who really disliked globalization and immigration, feeling unrepresented, maybe even feeling politically betrayed. This clearly helps explain the rise of conservative ethno-nationalist forces in the West. Does it explain populism? It might. Brexit and Trump clearly are populist phenomenon. I'm not sure, though, if all European ethno-nationalist forces should be understood as popular. But whatever their value in explaining the rise of right-wing populism in the United States and in Europe, these economic and cultural stories don't travel very well to Latin America, at least not in my view. The demand for populism in Latin America is not being fueled by globalization. It's not being fueled by immigration. It's certainly not being fueled by feminism and gay rights. Public anger is much deeper and I think more structural roots in Latin America. One of them is the persistence of extreme social inequality. Extreme social inequality exists when members of the political, economic, cultural elite have virtually no social connection with people who live, say, in the highlands or the shantytowns. They don't know them, they don't interact with them aside from hiring domestic help. And in fact, they barely recognize them as members of the same community. Extreme social inequality fuels populism, for sure, for a large block of voters to back a political outsider who promises to take a wrecking ball to the entire political elite. There's got to be a hell of a gap between that elite and everyday citizens. And inequality produces or helps to produce that gap. Populists mobilize the poor, at least in Latin America, around the idea that the elite does not represent them, that they've systematically excluded them, disparaged them, screwed them over. And in much of Latin America, they're not wrong. But I want to suggest that it's not just social inequality that drives populism in Latin America. It's also very much state weakening. You want to understand why Latin American voters get so angry at politicians, angry enough to throw them out in favor of a clown, of a priest, of a failed coup leader, you've got to look at the state, particularly state capacity. By state capacity, I mean the state's, or state incapacity, I mean the state's inability to carry out basic tasks that it sets for itself: collecting taxes, building roads and schools, implementing social programs, providing public security. When states are ineffective, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well, no matter how honest or well-intentioned they may be. Where states can't tax, where they can't get bureaucrats to do what they want, when they can't enforce the rule of law, even the best of governments are going to fail to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, to provide security, to protect consumers, to keep schools and hospitals supplied. They won't be able to control corruption. And when governments of any type consistently fail to deliver the goods, new democracies often get in trouble. Rather than being protected by the state, rather than being served by the state, citizens start to feel abandoned or mistreated by the state. And that is a major source of public discontent. But this discontent in Latin America is not distributed equally across society. In Latin America, state weakness always hits the poor harder than it hits the rich. The rich can live with an ineffective state. They have private schools, they have private health care. They can protect themselves with private security guards and private lawyers. And they've got well-connected friends in the state who can help them out when they've got problems with bureaucracy. The poor generally have none of these options available. They're stuck with lousy public schools and lousy public hospitals. They have no choice but to rely on inept, indifferent, and corrupt, often corrupt bureaucrats. And they live in a world in which the police and the courts almost always seem to be working for somebody else, usually somebody better connected and with more money. In other words, the law is perceived by many citizens to be applied unevenly and unfairly. And it seems to systematically benefit the wealthy and well-connected. This is crucial. If the state cannot ensure that citizens in the shantytowns, the highlands enjoy the basic rights and protections that are guaranteed to them by law, citizens are going to begin to feel like they're being unfairly treated by the state. And when that perception persists over time, from one government to another government to a third government, citizens start to conclude that all the political parties are the same, that all politicians are corrupt or no good, that no one in the political class represents them. And those citizens who are most likely to back political outsiders who promise to throw everybody out. So there's clearly a societal element, societal demand element to populism, both in the industrialized democracies and in much of the global South. But the roots of that demand vary a lot. The anger in Sweden is very different from the anger in Ecuador. And crucially, public discontent with the elite is not a new phenomenon in much of the global South. Certainly is not new in Latin America. So by themselves, I do not think that demand-side explanations can account for a rise in populism across the globe. I want to suggest that there's more to the contemporary rise of populism than just public anger and frustration. Again, public anger and frustration are not new. They have been widespread in a lot of places for a long period of time. What's new, I think, is a set of changes that affect the supply of populism. It is easier to be a populist today than it was 50 years ago because political establishments are weakening across the globe. By political establishment, I mean the set of interconnected individuals and organizations that possess the resources that politicians need to get elected and to maintain a political career. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on just three types of establishment organization. One is political parties. Parties are obviously important to politicians because they nominate candidates for public office. Where established parties are electorally dominant, they dominate the electoral landscape, their control over the candidate selection process allows them to effectively serve as political gatekeepers, filtering out outsiders, filtering out potentially candidates with extremist or anti-system views. Second type of establishment organization is business groups, organized labor, and other interest groups in general. Interest groups are a critical source of resources for political campaigns. Candidates everywhere need resources. They need money, they need activists. And historically, big business and to a lesser degree, big labor have provided those resources to candidates. Third type of establishment actor that I want to focus on is major media outlets, particularly major newspapers and TV networks. Access to the media obviously is essential to candidates' ability to reach voters. Without access to the media, at least traditionally, most parties, most candidates cannot achieve the kind of name recognition that they need to win elections. Now, I'm not Noam Chomsky. I do not view the establishment as a unitary actor. Political parties, interest groups, media outlets do not constitute a monolithic bloc. They do not have a single set of interests. In fact, there is a considerable degree of pluralism and competition among establishment actors. This is not a single bloc of a single interest. But collectively, the establishment does tend to impose certain parameters on politics, both in terms of political style and in terms of policy substance. There are certain norms governing how politicians are supposed to behave, how they dress, what they say, how they treat each other, how they treat the media. There are also certain policy positions or public stances that are considered beyond the pale. Till recently, openly racist stances were considered beyond the pale in the United States. Politicians who exceed those boundaries, who either exceed those programmatic boundaries or those normative boundaries, tend to be shunned by the establishment. That means party leaders won't support their nomination. It means that leading business associations, unions, other interest groups won't contribute to their campaigns. It means that mainstream media won't cover them, or if they cover them, their coverage will be very negative. Now, 50, 60, 70 years ago, that mattered a lot. Being shunned by the establishment mattered a lot in the 1950s or 60s because the establishment maintained a monopoly, a virtual monopoly, over the resources politicians needed to get elected. Party leaders 70 years ago controlled the candidate selection process. You couldn't get on the ballot without them. A relatively small number of interest groups provided the vast bulk of the finance and other campaign use. Again, business, labor unions. If you were shunned by big donors, you were out of luck, or more accurately, you were out of money. Finally, 50, 60 years ago, a relatively small number of major media outlets dominated the media scene. There were 2 or 3 major TV networks, a handful of influential newspapers. So at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CBS News decided that you were unfit for office, you were pretty much condemned to the political wilderness. Same was true of major media in Brazil, Venezuela, Chile, Colombia, Peru, the rest of Latin America. The fact that established political parties, interest groups, and major media outlets had a monopoly or a near monopoly over the resources politicians needed to get elected meant that any politician who was serious about getting elected had to be on good terms, reasonably good terms, with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of party bosses to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups to get their campaigns funded. They needed the approval, or at least the acceptance, of major media outlets in order to get decent coverage. That dependence on the establishment had important consequences, powerful consequences for democracy. It meant that politicians couldn't just respond to voters. They couldn't just give the people what they want because they had to maintain good terms or remain on good terms with the establishment. So 20th century politicians, late 19th and 20th century politicians, effectively had to strike a balance between appealing to voters on the one hand and remaining acceptable to the establishment on the other. That had a moderating effect on politics because it kept a whole bunch of politicians and issues effectively off the agenda. For the most part, obviously there were exceptions, but for the most part, only broadly pro-establishment candidates or politicians were likely to succeed over time. You broke with the establishment. You went all in as a populist in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, you faced a hell of an uphill battle. No major party nominations, little mainstream media access, few donors. Think about the case of Henry Ford in the United States. This is 100 years ago. Henry Ford was a Trump-like figure. He was wealthy, he was famous, he was really popular in the American heartland, and he was a political extremist who was admired by the Nazis. Henry Ford wanted to run for president as a Democrat in 1924. It was a grassroots campaign to get him to run. When Collier's magazine polled its readers in the summer of 1923, Ford came in first, way ahead of the other candidates. But in the 1920s, 1923, it was party leaders, not voters, who selected the presidential candidates. Collier's magazine also surveyed a set of politicians. It found zero support for Henry Ford. As Collier's editors wrote, and I quote, "Nobody denies the amount of Ford's sentiment among the masses of the people. Every Democratic leader knows his state is full of it, and he's afraid of it. He thinks, however, that because of the machinery of selection of delegates, there's little likelihood that Ford will make much of a showing." As Senator James Couzens put it, and I quote, "How can a man who has no training, no experience, aspire to such an office? It is most ridiculous." Ford never threw his hat in the ring, never ventured down that golden escalator. I don't know if he had a golden escalator. Probably not. Political parties, interest groups, establishment media were pretty effective gatekeepers, for better or worse, throughout much of the 20th century. Politicians who challenged the establishment, the folks we call populists, usually failed. This was not a terribly democratic system, but that's how 20th century democracy worked. It was very much a Schumpeterian system of elite competition. Political competition was real, but it was constrained in serious, systematic ways by politicians' dependence on the establishment. That establishment monopoly existed in democracies all over the world in the 20th century. US, UK, France, Germany, Canada, you name it. But not anymore. Over the last 3-4 decades, establishments across the globe have lost that monopoly over electoral resources. They've lost the monopoly of the resources that politicians need to get elected, which means that they're losing their influence over politicians. In the United States and the UK, established parties have lost their monopoly over candidates, thanks to intra-party democratization. And in the US, primaries have empowered voters, undermining seriously the gatekeeping capacity of party leaders. In the UK, the gatekeeping power now lies in the hands of party activists. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money on the internet. Bernie freaking Sanders raised as much money as Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden over 2 consecutive elections. And of course, the emergence of social media has eroded the influence of established media outlets. Today, Twitter, Facebook, other social media allow candidates to reach voters even if they're shunned by the mainstream media. I traveled to Sao Paulo, Brazil in July 2018, right at the beginning of the 2018 presidential election in Brazil. And I was actually brought down by some liberal business people who wanted me to try to convince their friends in the financial community not to support Bolsonaro. We didn't have much luck. But so I met with a bunch of business people. All of them, to a person, backed the establishment center-right candidate, Geraldo Alckmin. Even though Alckmin was way down in the polls, 4 or 5% in the polls, every business person I talked to was convinced that he would eventually win because he was backed by this broad coalition of mainstream parties, which following Brazil's election laws, gave him a huge, huge advantage in TV time, in time allocated for TV commercials. Alckmin had more than an hour a night, thanks to his coalition of mainstream parties, he had more than an hour a night of free TV time, whereas Bolsonaro had 6 or 7 seconds a night of TV time. And I don't know how actually that worked in practice, but 6 or 7 seconds a night. Nobody I talked to in Sao Paulo in July 2018, these were reasonably informed, intelligent people, nobody, not one of them, mentioned WhatsApp or YouTube. But Bolsonaro used those social media to effectively bypass TV networks, and of course, he won the election. Politicians today do not need the establishment. They can raise money online, they can reach voters via social media, they can hijack parties through primaries like Trump, or create their own parties like Korea and the 5-Star Movement. For politicians, this is pretty liberating. They can now respond directly to voters without worrying very much what the establishment thinks. They can break established norms so as to build a reputation as a maverick or as an outsider, as someone who's not beholden to the elite, as someone who's willing to tell it like it is. So unlike the 1950s and 1960s, politicians today really can give the people what they want. They can embrace positions that were previously considered off limits. Trump was openly racist. Bolsonaro praised torture, military coups. Evo Morales said he was going to end 500 years of colonialism. In fact, candidates today can openly campaign against the elite. They can promise to bury the establishment. And in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis in the West, in a context of heightened inequality, in a context of growing racial and cultural resentment, there was a fair amount of public demand for this sort of appeal. But here's the thing, again, there has always been a demand for populism among Western electorates, not just in Latin America, among Western electorates. Millions of Americans backed Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, Huey Long, George Wallace. What's really new now is the change that's happening on the supply side. It is just much easier to ignore, to bypass, even to oppose the establishment than it was 50, 75, 100 years ago. When Perón beat the Argentine establishment in 1946, that was a feat. That took a historic degree of mass mobilization. When Bukele did it a few years ago, really not that hard, not that hard. He beat the Salvadoran establishment by mobilizing 1.4 million followers on Facebook and 500,000 Twitter followers. Now, this new scenario that I'm describing is much more democratic than the old one. Political outsiders have a path to power today that was largely unavailable 50, 75, 100 years ago. And thanks to their newfound independence from the establishment, politicians are now free to be much more responsive to voters. They can really give the voters what they want. But sometimes what the people want is a candidate who will give the political elite a punch in the gut. In other words, the weakening of establishment gatekeepers opens the door to outsiders, but it also leaves democracies vulnerable to populism. As Jamie Loxton and I have shown, successful populists tend to assault democratic institutions. Perón, De la Guevara, Fujimori, Chavez, Correa, Morales, Bukele, Trump. This is a hell of a paradox. The weakening of political establishments is unquestionably democratizing. But this democratizing process may pose a threat to the liberal democratic institutions that emerged in the West in the late 19th and 20th century. Remember, Western elites used to hate democracy. Back in the 18th and 19th century, they were terrified of democracy because they equated it with rule by the people. What made democracy acceptable to elites was, first of all, counter-majoritarian institutions that constitute what we now know as liberal democracy. But also, the other thing that made democracy safe for elites was the power of political establishments. 19th and 20th century establishments imposed powerful constraints on democratic competition. They transformed what could have been a highly plebiscitary, highly majoritarian politics, transformed it into a much more bounded, elite-centered competition. The power of the establishment is what created Schumpeterian democracy, basically a system of elite competition. For better or worse, I'm suggesting 20th century democracy depended on a powerful establishment. But the days of Schumpeterian democracy, I think, are now coming to an end. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded dramatically, and it's very hard, at least for me, to envision that process reversing. I don't think the gatekeepers are going to get their power back. So regardless of the level of immigration, regardless of the level of cultural resentment, regardless of the level of competition from China, I think we are very likely to see more Trumps, more Bolsonaro, more Correas, more Bukele. Again, this change is profoundly democratizing. Just about anybody can win the presidency today in the United States, in Brazil, in Peru. And politicians, by and large, are becoming much more responsive to popular demand. But at the same time, this change clearly opens the door to demagogues, many of whom, not all, many of whom go on to assault liberal democratic institutions. So the long-term decline of political establishments brings greater democracy. But at the same time, I think it leaves liberal democracies, at least as constituted, more vulnerable. And how those democracies will hold up in this new populist era, I think, is anybody's guess. It's beyond my capacity for imagination. I'll stop there. Thanks.